I'm Jonathan Goell. This show is about how you as a photographer can control time. You can set your camera for short exposures, for long exposures, and for time exposures. This choice becomes especially important when you're taking pictures of subjects that move. From 1839 until the present, one thing that hasn't changed much in photography is that a picture is not just a slice of life, not just a visual fragment from the visual world preserved. It is also a slice of time. It's a moment preserved. And the length of that recorded moment is controlled by the shutter speed dial on your camera, which is here. These numbers indicate in fractions of a second the length of time that the shutter is going to be open. The shutter is like a door that opens and closes, which helps to control how much light will hit the film. It opens and closes automatically when you press the button, like that. Let's take a closer look. The exposures from 1,000, by the way, that stands for 1/1000th of a second. It's a high fraction. The numbers from 1/1000th of a second to 1/30th of a second, I'm going to be calling short exposures, instantaneous exposures. You would probably use those mostly for very bright sunny days. The exposures from 1/30th of a second down to 1 second, I'm going to call long exposures. You would tend to use long shutter speeds when the light was very dim. The last setting, B, is for time exposures. And if you stick with me, I'll tell you what the B stands for later on. Since the 1890s, with the advent of hand cameras, most exposures of light to film have really been quite short ones. At the turn of the century, an exposure of 1/25th of a second in broad daylight was considered a short and instantaneous exposure. Of course, in comparison to the several seconds to several minutes exposures of just a decade or two before, it was a short exposure. But as more sensitive films and faster shutters and faster lenses were developed, the shutter speeds for exposures shortened dramatically. Today, it's not uncommon to take a picture at 1/500th of a second at an aperture of f/16 in broad daylight with fast film. That's a dramatic increase. Here's some photographs that were taken at some short shutter speeds. This one was made at one of the old Boston Love-Ins some years back, and it's a number of people, of course, having a good time on this sunny day. Everybody is still, more or less standing still. The only sense of movement is from this child that is being shaken back and forth, let's say hefted up and down lovingly, by his father. This picture was made at 1/125th of a second. It was enough to freeze everyone else, but not enough for the child. But that's nice because the child gives us a sense of movement which helps make this picture interesting. Let me show you another picture which is a contrast to this one. This picture is by Frederick Weiss, and it seems rather strange, doesn't it? What do we have? A boy suspended in midair between two buildings. At least that's what he looks like. In fact, he was jumping off of a float into some water, which is just out of picture range, so that it's hard to see that. But it's amazing. This boy frozen almost instantaneously, frozen, suspended in midair. How is that done? Well, Frederick Weiss used a shutter speed of 1/1000th of a second. And at the moment the boy jumped, he pressed the shutter and instantly froze him in midair. 1/1000th of a second has the effect of stopping, of freezing action. Why would a high shutter speed stop a moving subject? Well, that's easy to explain, but first let me show you a shutter speed which couldn't possibly stop a moving subject. Here's a lens mechanism that has a shutter in it, and I'm going to set it for 1/15th of a second. Now watch it go. That might seem relatively fast to you, but it's a relatively long exposure in photographic terms. I'm next going to set it for 1/30th of a second. See? That's a little bit faster. And lastly, for a 400th of a second. Watch. That goes by so quickly that you can hardly see it. Now, keep those differences in mind as I go over here and take some pictures with an instant print camera of a moving train we have set up in our studio. At least it'll be moving as soon as I turn it on. To really make the contrast of the difference between these shutter speeds, I'm going to start photographing this train at 1/8 of a second, not even a 15th, but an eighth. I'll show you what I mean by that in a second. The second exposure is going to be at a 30th of a second, and the last exposure is going to be at 1/500th of a second. I'm going to take them all rapidly, one after another. Here we go. First one, 1/8 of a second. Second one, 30th of a second. And the last one at 1/500th of a second. That happened just in time, folks. Well, let's see what we have. The first picture was made at 1/8 of a second. Well, look at that. You can't see anything except a hopeless blur of the train. It's nothing but a record of motion. The reason is that over the space of 1/8 of a second, the train was able to move perhaps a couple of inches, 2-3 inches across the track. So the length of the blur, that length of movement, is recorded as a long length of blur in the final print. Second print was made at 1/30th of a second. Well, look. There's a little bit more detail in there. We can see a little bit more of the train. It's still not extremely sharp, but it's kind of nice. There's a record of the movement. Well, let's see what the last shot for comparison. The last shot is completely sharp. It was made at 1/500th of a second. In fact, it's so sharp, I may as well have made the picture of the train standing still. I prefer myself to have a picture that shows a little bit of motion if something is in fact moving. But it's nice to know that if you want to stop something that's moving very quickly, like someone on a bicycle or in a car, that you have the choice of using that high shutter speed. Remember, the higher that shutter speed, the sharper the moving subject is going to be in that final picture. Now, not all cameras have these very high shutter speeds, and in fact, not all conditions of daylight will be bright enough to allow you to use them anyway. There are still ways to get around this if you want to get sharp images of moving subjects. In this photograph by Frank Seitman, the subject is a young girl exuberantly moving in a swing back and forth. Well, Frank Seitman was able to get a sharp image of her in spite of her intense action at only a 250th of a second. If he had gone to the side and photographed her sideways motion, he would have had to switch to 1/1000th of a second to get it equally sharp. Why is that? When a subject is coming towards you, its motion takes up less length on the film during the length of the exposure, so you get less blur as a result. What about a subject where everything is moving in every direction, a child? Well, a child is completely unpredictable. Up, down, sideways, back and forth. Look at this picture by Lester Talkington, made in 1950, of a girl jumping rope. Now, I can tell two things from this picture. One, that it was not a bright day. There are no shadows. And two, that the shutter speed was somewhat slow, perhaps 1/100th of a second. Why? Because the jump rope is completely blurred out. It wasn't frozen. But the child is very sharp. How did he manage to do that? Well, Lester Talkington caught the child at the peak of her jump. That's the highest part. Basically, with any moving subject that goes up and down like this, there is a magical point after they've gone up and before they come down again that they are completely still. That's the time to take the picture. That's the peak. A little tip, though, when you're photographing something and going for the peak action, photograph it in advance of the peak, just a little bit. Set it off just before the person reaches the top. That accounts for the lag time inherent in the muscles of your fingers and in the mechanism of the camera. Let me show you now an entirely different kind of action picture. This one, appropriately enough, called Hot Rodders, taken in 1950 by Ralph Crane. Well, look at it. This is a highly energetic, racing, fantastic, energetic picture. The background is completely blurred out. Everybody's having an intense, jolly good time. How did he do that? Well, to get the background blurry and the moving subject sharp, he panned with the subject. That's quite simple. It means taking a picture of a moving subject at the same time your camera is dead aimed on the subject itself. That'll blur out the background and keep the subject sharp. Photographers very often take advantage of the blur of the background by deliberately setting a very slow shutter speed, 60th, maybe even a 15th of a second, to ensure that they will have a tremendous energetically blurred background, which heightens the sense of motion in a photograph. Here's a photograph of a different kind. There are all kinds of things happening in it. As a matter of fact, you can see someone with a camera. That's me. I took that picture in an escalator. There's a story that goes with this picture, and it makes a point. I was taking pictures in a store, and I had the camera already preset for, I think it was a 60th of a second at f4 or f5.6. In any case, I finished working and went up to get some lunch. The cameras were still with me. I climbed on the escalator, climbing along. All of a sudden, the escalator entered this area that had mirrors all over it, and instantly the space exploded before my eyes. I could see an infinite distance behind me, and of course there was this little girl nonchalantly standing there on the escalator with me. At the moment, just before we left the mirrored section, I raised the camera to my eye and snapped the picture and got it. An instant later, the mirrors were gone and the picture was gone. This kind of photography requires that you really be prepared. It means having your exposure already set. That's easy. If you're going to be in an area where lots of things are happening and you want to catch them quickly, go around and take some readings of a dark area and a light area in the scene, and then keep your camera preset at those areas, and when action happens, all you have to do is raise the camera to your eye. Keeping the camera prepared itself is not the only thing you need to do, though. You have to be mentally alert and prepared, too. You have to have your eyes and your sense of expectation to be so fast and so keen and so second nature to you that thought can be bypassed entirely at the right moment of exposure. Now, this is a skill, and like all skills, quite fortunately, you can learn it. I have a system for keeping this alertness in practice. Everywhere I go, I'm always noticing the constant flow and flux of activity in front of me. People coming and going, expressions changing, arms hailing cabs, everything. At some moment during all that activity, it all seems to come together into a picture just for a fraction of a second, and then it disappears again. So when I don't have my camera, I just enjoy those moments for themselves because they're rather fun to do. I mentally take the picture. But when I do have a camera, I'm ready and I take it. It's a nice kind of photography to do, and that sort of alertness is easy. You should, though, even in the most frenetic kind of photography, stay calm yourself. You don't want to jerk the camera like this when you're shooting quickly. You might want to wind quickly and move quickly, but at the moment of exposure, you want to press the shutter slowly and calmly and deliberately. Otherwise, you're going to be the biggest cause of the blur in the picture, a kind of blur you're not going to want. Between instantaneous exposures and long exposures, there's the other area called, between instantaneous and time exposures, there's an area called long exposures. That area between 1/30th of a second and 1 second. Here are two photographs made by Stan Grossfeld for the Boston Globe. It's kind of a sequence. In the first picture, we see firemen sitting around a table. I imagine the room is fairly dark. He most likely had to use a long exposure, maybe 1/4 of a second, 1/8 of a second. The second picture shows what happened at the moment the bell sounded in the fire station and all of the men jumped up at once. Bang! And at that moment, of course, Stan Grossfeld set off his shutter again and he got it. What happened? He got a record of the motion of them rising from the chairs and standing during the length of the exposure. So there's a tremendous rush of activity in this picture. The two pictures together make it, a very interesting pair. When making long exposures of 1/30th of a second below, you need some means of holding the camera very, very steady. If you're not going to use a tripod, which I'm going to talk about in a little while, there's still things you can do to ensure that you're going to be able to hold the camera steady enough to get sharp pictures. Let me show you one. The most important one, in fact, for exposures of any length, is to keep your elbows at your side and to brace the camera lightly against your forehead like this, and very easily, while cradling the camera, set off the shutter like that. That works very well. Be calm. The second way is to take the strap, which is a very useful tool, and pull it around the back of your head like this, and simultaneously gripping both the strap and the camera, you grip the camera like this so that in fact you could do that if you needed to. And again, if you hold your head steady enough, you should be able to get a sharp picture at a somewhat long shutter speed. The last thing you can do, and in fact a lot of photographers have entirely different ways, you can develop your own method, is to put the strap around your shoulder like that, and if it's short enough, you pull up on it until the straps are taut, and then look through the camera, and again make your picture. You can invent your own system too. So far I've talked about short exposures and long exposures. Now what about time exposures? Time exposures begin at 1 second and can go as long as seconds, minutes, or even hours. It's a sort of an exposure that you control yourself. Generally, time exposures are made of subjects that happen to be in relative darkness, and you use a long time exposure in order to make up for that fact so the film can be properly exposed. This picture was made of a hallway in a 500-year-old Roman building. And although it doesn't look it, this hallway was so dark that I had to use an exposure of 10 minutes at an aperture of about f/16 in order to make it look like it does. Now this points to the fact that most time exposure subjects are still subjects, but there are some moving subjects which can be very well photographed with a time exposure as well. And in fact, there are some subjects which you can't even see when they move unless you do take them with a time exposure. This picture is by Jerry Burchard. Jerry Burchard likes to do handheld time exposures. In this case, he put his camera, I think it was on a step or on a rock, he doesn't use tripods, and made an exposure in the night sky of maybe 15 minutes to half an hour. And he got a tracing of the stars as they went across the sky. It's a very interesting and exciting effect. We could not see that effect by ourselves with our own eye, but a camera can. It's one of those times when photography can help make things that are invisible visible to us. Here's another photograph where time exposure was used for a particularly interesting effect and to create a certain emotional impression, by the way, too. This picture by Wynne Bullock was made at a seashore area, probably at dawn or dusk when it wasn't too light out, probably at an exposure, I would say, longer than 30 seconds. See that mist that's around the rocks? That's not fog. That's really an impression of the movement of the water during that 30-second or minute exposure. Things that move, which normally are solid, in a time exposure they tend to disappear into a mist. Well, Wynne Bullock has used that to very good advantage to create an interesting photograph as a result. Now, how can you work with time exposures? First, you need an adjustable camera, one with a shutter speed dial. More specifically, you need a camera that has a B setting on its shutter speed dial, which allows you to keep the shutter open as long as you keep your finger on the button. The B stands for, not time exposure, although it does in a way, it really stands for the word bulb. In the old days, and maybe not so long ago, 50 years ago, if you wanted to take a time exposure, you would set the shutter to B, as now, and plug in a bulb release, an air release that looked like this. When you open the shutter, when you pressed it, the shutter would open, and when you let it go, the shutter would close. That's how you made time exposures. In fact, you can still get things like this today. When you're going to do a time exposure, choose your film carefully. If you want to take a picture where it's particularly dark, like in the woods, and you don't want to be there all night long with just a single exposure, choose a very high speed or fast film, 200 ASA or 400 ASA. On the other hand, if you want to take time exposures and experiment with movement effects like this, where there's already a fair amount of light, such as in your living room with a light bulb on, choose a slower speed film, less than 125 ASA, stop your camera down to a relatively small aperture, make the camera steady, and you'll be able to get exposures of 15 seconds to a minute in a normally lit room. You can have a lot of fun doing that. To get sharp pictures is something you can use that can help, and that is a shutter release cable. It's a modern version of the air bulb that the old cameras used. This is what it is. It's a little flexible cable like this, and it has a threaded end. You take that and you screw it into the shutter release socket here. Cock your camera, and then you set it off with that. I like shutter releases that have a little locking pin, this device here. What this enables you to do is to set off the camera, then you tighten that down, and you could go away and leave it for half an hour, come back, and then loosen it up, and your exposure will be over. Shutter release with a locking pin. Above all, you need a system for keeping your camera rock steady during the time exposures, or your pictures are not going to be sharp. They'll be blurry from camera movement. You can, of course, do what we've done here, and that is put your camera on a table and make your exposure. You can put your camera against a wall like this and make your exposure, but then it's hard to see through it. In a restaurant, I often do something like this. I'll balance my camera on a glass. I'll hold it on the glass, to be more specific, and then set it off that way. This makes it possible for me to still sight if I want to see my picture. And of course, I won't get a picture of so much of the table. Really, though, the best thing to get, I think, is a tripod. I think you knew I was coming to that anyway. A tripod is a three-legged mechanical device like this, which folds up, by the way, into a smaller package than this, on which you can put your camera. Now, the tripod is equipped with a little 1/4-inch threaded screw here, and the bottom of the camera has a threaded socket for this screw. You mount the camera on the tripod in the tripod socket. Now, this will help ensure that for time exposures, the camera is going to be pretty steady. I like a tripod that has long legs. That is, a tripod that can get up to my eye level or near it without having to extend too far the center pole. When you start extending the center pole, say if you extended it this high, when you set off the camera, you might get vibrations which tremor throughout the pole. The tripods are at their strongest when the camera is down right on top of the three legs like this. Let me give you some tips for using cameras on tripods. The main thing is, after you've wound it, let the camera settle for a few seconds. When you wind a camera, it sets up all kinds of tremors in a tripod. Some tripods react almost like tuning forks. Let them settle down, and then very carefully take the picture like that. Now, this isn't the only kind of tripod you can get. You can also get an inexpensive little number called a table tripod. It looks like this. You take it out, you could put this in your pocket, open up its three legs, tighten it. It has a little movable head like this. Take the camera, and again, with the tripod socket, attach it like this. A lot of photographers have both of these tripods, by the way. This enables you to take very steady time exposures, resting it on a table. Now, although you can't take this tripod up to 6 or 7 feet like you can the big one, this little tripod can do some special things that the big ones can't. Watch this. You can brace it like this on your chest, and you can also brace it against a wall like this. Figuring out the right exposure for a time exposure is the next thing, and it's a little bit more difficult than calculating exposures for daylight. The thing to do, of course, is to experiment. Take a camera, load it with some very high-speed film, 200 ASA to 400 ASA. Get a pad, get a pencil, take all of this and go outside at night and take some time exposures. Now, for a starter, a night scene perhaps, set your lens at a relatively wide aperture and try taking pictures at 1 second, 5 seconds, 20 seconds, and 40 seconds, perhaps even longer. Take notes on all of these exposures, and when you get the results back, compare the pictures with the notes. And the picture that looks the best, you check and see what that exposure was, and use that for all subsequent street scene pictures in that area. Your street scene or another street scene can be photographed, probably successfully, at that time. If you want more precision in determining a time exposure, you should get a handheld light meter. The reason is that these are really a lot more sensitive than the meters built into most cameras today. This one can only read an exposure down to a 25th of a second at f2, but this one can get you exposures of minutes and seconds and hours accurately calculated. However, it's still not quite as simple as all that. You might take a reading and get a suggested exposure in very low light of, 2 seconds at an aperture of f2.8. The trouble is photographic film has a tendency to lose speed, has a tendency to slow down when it's very dark out. So you have to compensate for that. That means if the meter's recommending a 2-second exposure, you'll really get a better exposure if you set it for 4 seconds or open up the aperture one stop. It's a compensating effect that you have to do. Anyway, it's pretty easy. In the last few seconds, I'd like to show you some pictures which relate to what we've been talking about. This picture by Jeff Winningham was photographed at the Coliseum in Houston, Texas, and it shows wrestlers, one of them flying through the air, and Winningham caught him in midair at a very high shutter speed. I don't know what it was, but maybe it was a 250th or a 500th of a second. Fantastic picture, the decisive moment, beautifully rendered. Everybody, of course, caught looking at him. The next picture is by Donald Dietz, and you see dancers that appear to be blurry, sort of diaphanous in appearance. Well, the camera, I suspect, was on a tripod, and he used a long exposure, a second, maybe 2 seconds, time exposure, and the dancers were caught in various positions as they danced throughout the long exposure. It's beautiful. The last picture was made by, well, the third picture was made by Ernst Haas, and it's a pan shot of runners with a time exposure, maybe over a second, and the runners have been abstracted into a blur, a pattern, and these streaks of light, which were glints off the sea on the beach behind the runners, also become horizontal blurs. The picture is no longer of runners, but about speed and motion. The last picture was made by Andreas Feininger in 1949. It shows a helicopter taking off. How does it show that? Well, the helicopter had lights on the end of its blades, and Feininger used a time exposure to photograph it. The helicopter took off, went up, and the entire travel path was recorded in the long exposure. Have a good time, go out, experiment with all kinds of time exposures, and I'll see you next time.